The most powerful is the Sinaloa Cartel. Almost the 70% of the world is infected by this cartel.
They are known as Los Chapitos, the four most trusted sons of the world's most notorious drug kingpin. As the I-Team has reported for several years, federal drug investigators here in Chicago consider El Chapo's sons in charge of the Sinaloa Cartel that remains this area's largest trafficker of heroin, coke, meth.
Los Chapitos were El Chapo's young, innocent sons before he groomed them into ruthless killers and cartel leaders. But being a world-famous millionaire drug lord comes with its fair share of tragedy. In 2008, El Chapo lost his son Edgar after a shockingly gruesome attack. What made it even more shocking was the shooter, El Macho Prieto. He was El Chapo's man, so why would a Sinaloa Cartel member shoot the boss's son? And what were the brutal repercussions for El Macho Prieto? This is the full story of the Sinaloa Cartel and the tragic story of Edgar Guzman Lopez and everything that followed. To understand everything that led up to Edgar's gruesome death, we have to go back to the very beginnings of the Sinaloa Cartel. You see, the Sinaloa kingpins, El Chapo and El Mayo, met while working for Mexico's first modern-day cartel, the Guadalajara. The Guadalajara cartel was a huge name in the 1980s. Miguel Angel Felix Gallardo, aka El Padrino, founded the cartel with Rafael Caro Quintero. These two were the first to think, hey, we can work together with the Colombian cartels to ship white powder into the United States. Needless to say, it was an excellent decision, financially speaking. Throughout the 1980s, the Guadalajara cartel controlled most of the drug trafficking in Mexico and the corridors along the U.S. border. It had operations in regions from Jalisco to Baja California, Colima, Sonora, Chihuahua, and Sinaloa, just to name a few. The giant Tijuana, Juarez, and Sinaloa cartels originally started out as branches, or plazas, of the Guadalajara cartel. Yep, this was the beginning of El Chapo's drug empire. His biggest opportunity would come at the Guadalajara's biggest mistake in 1985. As the Guadalajara cartel grew in size and power, the Mexican government as well as the DEA became more interested in stopping their operations. In 1984, DEA agent Kiki Camarena led a huge operation against the cartel. In 1984, acting on information from the DEA, 450 Mexican soldiers backed by helicopters destroyed a 1,000-hectare, or 2,500-acre, marijuana plantation in Allende, Chihuahua, known as Rancho Buffalo, with an estimated annual production of $8 billion. It's easy to see how the Guadalajara kingpins were angered by this stint. They just lost a massive chunk of their business in a blink of an eye, and we all know how vengeful cartels can be. It's an eye for an eye until someone dies in a really gruesome way. On February 7, 1985, a group of police officers in El Padrino's pocket kidnapped Kiki Camarena in broad daylight and dragged him to Rafael Quintero's safe house. For 30 hours, he was tortured in the most stomach-turning ways imaginable. When he lost consciousness, a doctor on site would bring him back to life so he could feel everything. Finally, he was murdered. The cartel didn't even want to extract information from him. They just wanted him to pay for destroying their business. But by taking Kiki's life, the Guadalajara dug their own hole. A month later, Kiki's body was found wrapped in plastic in a rural side of Michoacan. His skull was punctured by a piece of rebar, and his ribs were broken. The consequence was the DEA's largest homicide investigation to this day. When the DEA traced the murder back to El Padrino and Quintero, they decided the Guadalajara would be turned to ashes. While Kiki Camarena received tons of posthumous awards and mentions, the Guadalajara bosses were systematically arrested, killed, and forgotten. And so it goes for most kingpins. But for El Chapo, this was an opportunity. Remember how the Sinaloa was a mere plaza to the Guadalajara? Well, now he could turn it into a standalone cartel. El Chapo had learned from the best, in other words, the most violent, reckless drug lords in Mexico. Apart from his exceptional tunneling skills, El Chapo had a thirst for power and a willingness to do whatever it took to get to the top. He understood early on that the best way to do that is to employ what Pablo Escobar would call
plata o plomo.
Officers, officials, and rival cartel members would be invited to work with him. In that case, they'd be bribed or put on his payroll. If they refused, well, that would earn them a death sentence. Sometimes their families would die too. Other reports say the families would be violated and tortured before being murdered. Savvy and ruthless as he was, El Chapo infiltrated the government until he had several high-ranking officers on his payroll. So every time the Sinaloa cartel makes $1, some pennies enter the officials' pockets. This way, instead of fighting the Sinaloa cartel, the government protects them.
Why do you think they let you do what you do?
Porque la mayoría de las ganancias van a dar a ellos.
para los altos mandos del gobierno.
When El Chapo was arrested for the final time in 2016, some really nasty things were revealed at his trial. It turns out he wasn't just a cold and calculated businessman ordering hits and deals from an ivory tower. He was a psychopathic murderer who loved getting his hands dirty. His former bodyguard described several horrific accounts of El Chapo killing enemies with his bare hands and torturing them for days first. He had burns made with an iron on his back. His shirt was stuck to his skin. He had burns made with a cigar lighter all over his body. His feet would be burned. El Chapo kept this poor man in a wooden structure for days on end. He interrogated him, but the man wouldn't say what El Chapo wanted to hear. So, El Chapo would shoot him, but not fatally, over and over again. He would bury him alive a few days later. And in 2010, El Chapo killed rival cartel member Hugo Hernandez. Then he cut off his face and sewed it to a soccer ball. The rest of his body was found cut in tiny pieces in 2 ice chests. His message was for the authorities. Hernandez's face, sewn onto a football, was left in a plastic bag near City Hall. A note read, "Happy New Year, because this will be your last." Guys, this is just to paint a picture of who El Chapo is. Now, imagine he has 24 kids. Apart from being a brutal drug lord, El Chapo is also a family man. He has anywhere between 10 and north of 20 kids by at least 4 women. Although the reports are murky and the numbers differ from source to source, what's clear, however, is his eldest sons were subjected to grooming from a very young age. His eldest daughters, Rosa Isela Guzman Ortiz and Gisela Guzman Salazar, were thankfully left alone. But in Mexican cartel tradition, El Chapo saw his sons as destined to take over his blood empire. Ivan Archibaldo, Jesus Alfredo, Edgar, Joaquin, and Ovidio were his 5 eldest. The father didn't even wait for them to reach their teenage years before he introduced them to this work. The workdays at the Sinaloa Cartel involved bribery, threats, torture, and murder. Following Ovidio's arrest in 2023, this is what was revealed. Once information was obtained by these captives, typically through torture, these individuals were killed, either by or at the direction of the Chapitos themselves, and the bodies disposed of throughout the area. While many of these victims were shot, others were fed dead or alive to tigers. For approximately 2 hours, members of the Chapitos tortured victim 5 by inserting a corkscrew into victim 5's muscles, ripping it out of his muscles, and placing hot chilies in his open wounds and nose before being shot dead by Ivan Archibaldo Guzman Salazar, the indictment alleges. The victim and his fellow slain officer were then dumped near a motel off the highway near the ranch. It's safe to say El Chapo was successful in grooming them to take over his cartel. In fact, after El Chapo's arrest and extradition to the U.S., Los Chapitos made the Sinaloa Cartel even more powerful.
They are known as Los Chapitos, the 4 most trusted sons of the world's most notorious drug kingpin. As the I-Team has reported for several years, federal drug investigators here in Chicago consider El Chapo's sons in charge of the Sinaloa Cartel that remains this area's largest trafficker of heroin, coke, meth.
El Chapo's 4 sons built state-of-the-art labs in the jungles, expanding the smuggling routes, and took the Sinaloa Cartel to almost every country on the planet. But wait, weren't there 5 sons? Indeed. Edgar Guzman Lopez was only 22 when he was gunned down in a parking lot on May 8, 2008. It was a tragedy El Chapo and his sons would never recover from, and someone would pay harshly for this. This side of the story begins with Gonzalo Inzunza, aka El Macho Prieto. He was born on August 17, 1971 in Sinaloa. Not only was he born into an area rife with petty crime and drug trafficking, but his childhood was also ridden with tragedy. Gonzalo was the son of a drug trafficker, Rene Inzunza. Exposed to violence and big risk operations, Rene was killed when Gonzalo was still a child. Gonzalo didn't steer away from this world. Much like Los Chapitos, instead of being scared off, he was attracted to this dark world and wanted to make the big bucks, just like his dad. When he was only 19, Gonzalo pulled out a gun and killed a man in front of dozens of shocked partygoers. He didn't even give him a chance to run. He just wanted to make his first kill. Afterward, El Macho fled the state of Sonora, escaping arrest. But his worst crimes were still ahead. In Sonora, he made a name for himself. He was especially brutal, even for those in the drug trade where violence is normalized. He was the kind that shot first and asked questions later. And when people owed him money, he would hunt them down and kill them. Once, his group of gunmen killed a group of men owing him money at a children's party. It was around the time that El Macho caught the eye of El Mayo, El Chapo's right-hand man and the Sinaloa's second boss. In fact, according to some sources, El Mayo was the actual ruler of the Sinaloa Cartel, leading most of his expanding and trafficking operations in the 1990s. When El Chapo was on trial in the United States, he said people should look at El Mayo as the actual kingpin and the more brutal one of the two. He claimed he was sort of a puppet in El Mayo's vicious hands. However, that could have been an attempt to make himself look less guilty. But back to El Macho. El Mayo saw great potential in El Macho's thirst for power, vengeance, and blood. He could make a great Sinaloa captain, right? So when El Mayo invited El Macho to join the Sinaloa ranks, he couldn't refuse. Within a few years, his ruthlessness earned him a position as El Mayo's chief assassin. Culiacan and its neighboring towns were now terrified of the name El Macho. Look at him the wrong way and you got a death sentence. And if he felt like it, he'd kill your entire family too. According to Mexican authorities, El Macho was personally responsible for north of 80 murders during his time in Sinaloa. Among these 80 were a dozen police officers. El Macho lined them up and executed them military style. He had no regard for human life, and he took pleasure in killing officers, who the Sinaloa saw as their worst rivals. Of course, the police were the Sinaloa's fiercest rivals for a long time, and they struggled to put El Macho behind bars. But El Macho always seemed one step ahead. One time, 2 patrol cars from the federal police entered his territories to arrest one of his sicarios. That's when El Macho's gunmen ambushed the cars and forced the officers to call their boss. When the boss arrived, El Macho personally attacked him and confiscated the officers' weapons. He then declared his territory off limits from any law enforcement whatsoever. Then, in 2002, the Federal Preventive Police intercepted a convoy of sicarios including El Macho himself, but El Macho was ready for this. The shootout that ensued was huge. 4 police officers and a sicario were killed. Others barely survived. This was the kind of bloodshed that followed El Macho everywhere he went, and it was almost like he was looking forward to the police encounters. The more officers he could kill, the better if you asked him. By the early 2000s, his reputation grew with the Sinaloa Cartel. He was terrifying even to his fellow assassins. In 2005, he was finally arrested by the Mazatlan Municipal Police, along with 8 of his sicarios. Although he had a plethora of weapons on him and a long criminal record, El Macho managed to evade justice once more. How, you ask? The same way El Chapo escaped prison twice before his 2016 arrest. El Macho bribed his way out of prison. El Macho was back at it, and El Mayo couldn't be happier about it. He was one of the most trusted men and fiercest protectors. During El Macho's time as head of assassins, the Sinaloa Cartel acquired new territories and destroyed any enemy attempts to take their turf. The Sinaloa expanded the biggest cartel in the world, and El Macho was partially responsible for it. But one day, El Macho made such a big mistake that he was not only kicked out of the cartel, he was reduced to dust. El Macho's notoriety grew around the same time as El Chapo's boys. By the late 2000s, Los Chapitos were young men, violent young men ready to take over their father's business in the event of an arrest. El Macho wasn't the only famous assassin anymore. In the late hours of May 8, 2008, 3 men were in a shopping center's parking lot, waiting for their friend in complete darkness. It's then a convoy of 5 vans ambushed the men. 20 men with armed long weapons and bulletproof vests sprung out of the vans and started shooting at the men. One of the men shot the mall's neon sign with a bazooka. It immediately exploded. The 20 gunmen opened their rifles into the 3 men waiting in the parking lot. One of the men was Edgar Guzman Lopez. In a few weeks, he would have been 23. Now he was lying on the ground in a pool of blood, reduced to nothing but a pile of meat. He'd been shot 500 times. All 3 men were killed within seconds. Imagine how El Chapo felt when he heard what happened. To this day, there are 2 versions of what happened that night. The first version tells the story of an ongoing war between the Sinaloa and the Beltran-Leyva cartels. In January of that year, Alfredo Beltran-Leyva was arrested by the Mexican army, and this was a huge blow to the cartel. The other bosses suspected El Chapo of foul play. Perhaps he pointed the police in Alfredo's direction. Alfredo's brothers, Arturo, Carlos, and Hector, decided El Chapo should pay in the same way they suffered. So they sent their best sicarios to kill one of his most trusted sons. But that's just one version. The other version tells a stranger story. Reportedly, the sicarios who destroyed Edgar and his friends were led by El Macho himself. So why did the Sinaloa's man kill the Sinaloa boss's son? The answer? A simple but tragic case of mistaken identity. In early May 2008, El Chapo ordered the assassination of El Guacho. He was also a young man who looked similar to his sons. Even worse, he was out shopping at the same center as Edgar on the same night. And remember, it was really dark in the parking lot that night. A long list of creepy coincidences led El Macho to make the fateful mistake. He was one of the cartel's most trusted assassins, yet in the blink of an eye, his reputation was completely destroyed. Now he had to die for his mistake. Until that day, El Macho was protected by El Mayo, whatever the context. Whether he was being threatened by a rival cartel member, the police, or a Sinaloa boss, El Macho used to be safe. El Mayo needed him, except now, El Mayo couldn't protect him from El Chapo. They were equals, and kingpins' families are sacred. No one touches them. El Mayo knew El Chapo would be out for blood, so he left his right-hand man without protection. However, he couldn't just send his man to die, so he arranged for a transfer. El Macho was thus transferred to Sonora, where he proceeded to oversee drug trafficking in the area. But by 2011, someone else wanted him dead. Manuel Torres Felix, another huge figure in the Sinaloa Cartel. Manuel was a notorious trafficker who had excellent relationships with both El Chapo and El Mayo, and at the time, he was also El Macho's boss. El Macho might have been on the run from El Chapo, but old habits die hard. He was still a ruthless murderer and took pleasure in hunting down people who had wronged him. Around 2010, he killed someone without getting the go-ahead from his boss. Manuel was furious. When he put out a hit on Macho's head, Macho fled once again, this time to Baja California. However, he continued to live in constant fear of getting caught, arrested, or killed. He knew Manuel and El Chapo had men everywhere. If they really wanted him dead, they could have him killed in an instant. In 2012, Manuel Felix Torres was killed in a shootout with Mexican soldiers. For a brief moment, El Macho felt like he dodged a bullet. Apart from overseeing trafficking, El Macho ran a giant car theft ring in Mexico and the United States, and his drug operations spanned several cities along the Pacific coast. But instead of becoming a calm and calculated boss, he remained the mad dog that he always was. He would kill people who looked at him the wrong way and personally attack officers instead of letting his sicarios do the dirty work. One time, he killed a well-known real estate agent. Apparently, El Macho blamed the agent for raiding one of his safe houses. There was no evidence for this, just a hunch. But El Macho killed many people over hunches. As you probably know though, when you kill people, you make enemies. And El Macho had been killing people for 2 decades. His day of reckoning was definitely coming. As El Macho got more powerful, his behavior only got more violent and erratic. No one knew when he'd burst into a fit of rage, and people were genuinely scared for their lives whenever they had to interact with him. But El Macho still worked for the Sinaloa Cartel, so even from several states away, El Mayo became concerned. El Macho was becoming a problem and he needed to be eliminated. However, this wouldn't be an easy job. After all, El Macho was a notorious assassin. He'd led dozens of groups into battle and he knew the Sinaloa tactics all too well. In fact, he created some of them. El Mayo knew he couldn't just bring his man into an open fight with El Macho. It would not end well on his territory. Instead, El Mayo phoned the Mexican government and dropped them El Macho's location. On December 18, 2013, a special task force combining Marines and the federal police arrived at a villa where El Macho thought he was safe. He was due to return to Puerto Penasco in a convoy made of 3 SUVs. His convoy was also being attacked in real time by an American aircraft. That's when it ran into a blockade on the state highway. Immediately, El Macho's bodyguards jumped out of the SUVs and started firing their rifles at the officers. A pair of sicarios even tried to gun down a helicopter hovering about the shootout. Sicarios were dying like flies and were heavily outnumbered, and the Marines had equipment that was no match for anything else. Meanwhile, El Macho and his 2 bodyguards were still inside the villa. In the same complex, dozens of terrified people were running around, trying to figure out what was happening and hoping to escape unharmed from this chaotic shootout. El Macho was also desperate. He was phoning and trying to get backup to come to his address. He knew this would be the end for him. 2 bodyguards could never protect him from an army of Marines and federal agents. However, his bodyguards had rifles and grenades. So every time the officers would try and approach their villa, they would throw grenades at them, and they would retreat. This went on for 3 hours. El Macho took a walkie-talkie from his gunman and pleaded for backup some more. However, one Marine was quick enough to make it all stop. He shot El Macho from a nearby window. With one perfect shot, El Macho was killed. His bodyguards escaped with his body, taking him to his home territory. This was one final act to show their devotion to their fierce boss. Authorities confirmed El Macho's death later that day. It was a great victory for Mexican authorities. They'd been out to get him for the last 2 decades. El Macho's death may have felt like a huge victory at the moment, but in the grand scheme of things, it's the natural ending for any drug lord or cartel assassin. Whether they like it or not, most of these people end up in prison or dead. Even El Chapo knew this. While he groomed his sons to become Los Chapitos, he knew that they would have to take over his job when he gets arrested or killed. And in 2016, he got arrested for a third time. The first 2 times, he was able to escape through bribery. The second time, he even built a mile-long tunnel under the Mexico's highest security prison. So the third time, the American government was adamant that El Chapo had to be extradited. After a year-long trial, he was sentenced to life in prison at the ADX Florence, the U.S.'s highest security federal prison. He will die in prison. No amount of bribery will get him out. However, the days of the Sinaloa Cartel are far from over. Even with El Chapo behind bars for the rest of his life, the Sinaloa Cartel continues to be Mexico's most powerful criminal organization.
The most powerful is the Sinaloa Cartel. Almost the 70% of the world is infected by this cartel.
Ovidio, Ivan, and Jesus expanded all El Chapo's business by building new, more profitable labs and extending their trafficking routes from the U.S. to the whole world. They also bought huge quantities of ephedrine from Argentina. This is the ingredient used in making meth. If anything, it seems like Los Chapitos are even more business savvy than their father. El Chapo's legacy affects the world in many ways. For starters, Mexico and the United States share a giant border of almost 2,000 miles. Their culture and businesses are closely intertwined. In 2018 alone, trade between Mexico and the U.S. generated $671 billion. But lately, tensions have been growing between the two countries, and for one single reason: cartels. Reportedly, cartels make between $19 to $29 billion a year just from the U.S. Mexico is the world's 13th largest economy, and the U.S. is only second to China. Today, Mexico is on the rise as one of the most cost-effective places to locate manufacturing operations. Lots of these operations are leaving China and moving to Mexico for better skilled and lower paid labor. For geopolitical reasons, balancing economic power like that is good. But all of this is in peril because the cartels seem to be in control of the government, and this is affecting the American government's outlook on Mexico as a whole.
If Americans start to think of Mexicans as drug runners again, regardless of why, that damages our most productive trading relationship and our most brilliant opportunity for our future right out of the gate.
Why are we saying cartels are in control? Well, just look at Edgar Guzman's 2019 arrest attempt, also known as Black Tuesday. On October 17, 2019, the Mexican military raided Ovidio's home and arrested him for a long list of crimes. But as his brothers, El Chapo's sons, got word of this, hell rained on the officers. 9 people were brutally murdered and dozens of officers were seriously injured as a whole war was unleashed.
Pase, por favor, pase, por favor. Pasen los tres. Tranquilo. Aquí, señor. Afuera. Tranquilo. Listo. ¿Dónde aquí tomamos? ¿Traes armas?
No. The sicarios released cartel prisoners, set fire to cars to block important roads, and invaded the local airport. Trade and travel were completely stopped in the Sinaloa region for hours. The message was simple: you don't mess with the Sinaloa Cartel. You don't mess with El Chapo's sons. Ovidio himself seemed to try and stop the massacre before it all happened.
No, no tengo, son mis hijas, oiga. Paren, diles que paren todo. Ya. No, no más. Ya no quiero que haya desmadre.
But this organization is larger than life, and its ego is fragile. They're playing hardball, knowing they can intimidate the government and seize control of money and power. Sadly, it worked. That year, Ovidio was released from custody and was free to do the Sinaloa Cartel's bidding for 4 more years, until his 2023 arrest. Mexico's president explained his decision.
No puede valer más la captura de un delincuente que las vidas de las personas.
But here's the problem. Falco Ernst, senior analyst for the International Crisis Group in Mexico, said the release of Edgar Guzman set a dangerous precedent and sent a message that the state itself, including the army, could be blackmailed and was not in control. Exactly. Now the cartel's no violence works. So, in the infamous war on drugs, each cartel ups their brutal game, knowing this is the only currency that keeps them at the top of the game. Mexican cartels are deemed a regional security threat in Mexico and the U.S. And of course, they're a threat to all those who stand in their way. In January 2023, El Raton was finally arrested a second time. and it's likely he will also be extradited to the US to face the same fate as his father. But the Sinaloa's response was once again horrific. This time, 10 officers and 19 sicarios were killed. The city was brought to a halt once more, and people were instructed to stay indoors if they wanted to protect their lives. This time, however, it didn't work. Ovidio remains behind bars, and the president is unwilling to budge. Perhaps there's a little light at the end of the tunnel. Just like Edgar, Ovidio met a sudden end to his bloody career. Well, at least Ovidio is alive, but as tragic as it may be, death is often imminent and unavoidable for violent drug lords. Today, El Chapo still has 3 trusted sons upping their cartel's violent ante. And with Los Chapitos grooming their own sons to become violent drug lords, who knows if it will ever stop. Thanks a bunch for watching. Leave a comment and let us know your thoughts on the Sinaloa Cartel and El Chapo's family. And before you go, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit that bell button. See you next time.